repping Packers fans in the 715. It's the 715 Green and Gold Tailgate Podcast.
What's going on, everybody? Dan Casper here for another episode of the 715 Green and Gold Tailgate Podcast, a part of the Man Cave Podcast. It's a part of our tailgate series on the Man Cave Podcast. You can follow and subscribe to the 715 Green and Gold Tailgate Podcast on like Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. Or if you're not already following the Man Cave Podcast, do that. It's available through there as well. So again, big thanks for tuning in. I know it's the offseason for the Packers, but we're going to try to continue to pump out some weekly podcasts here because we still got stuff to talk about in the offseason, leading up to free agency, leading up to the draft, and all that good stuff, and any other news that may be popping up. So on this episode, we're going to kind of recap, or I shouldn't say recap, but we're going to do a little off-season self-scouting and taking a look at certain position groups for the Packers, kind of taking a look back at what we saw from that group during the season, and with an eye to the future, what are they going to do? Are they going to do some adjustments? Are they good at that spot? Or just kind of doing some grading and assessing, if you will. But before we get to that, because we're going to hit up on 4 groups for this episode, 4 groups. Before we get to that, we know the Packers are currently looking for 2 position coaches, a quarterback's coach and a defensive line coach. We've heard about some interviews with the defensive line coach, Casey Rogers, Tampa Bay. I think that was every Packers fan favorite from the ones that we had heard being interviewed, the Tampa Bay defensive line coach and run game coordinator. Well, he's going to Detroit. Detroit hired him for the same position, defensive line coach. So I think if you ask a lot of Packers fans, that was probably a little bit of a bummer for them because that was probably the guy that they wanted to get. So that's not happening. What about the other guys that we at least have heard about, that we at least heard about that the Packers have interviewed? Washington spent defensive coordinator with the Bears last year, defensive line coach history. You also have Aaron Whitcomb from the Jets, or Whitcott, or White, excuse me, from the Jets there. So that's obviously a Robert Saleh connection to that, which, I mean, that you can connect the dots. It's not too many dots there. Saleh being LaFleur's best friend and vice versa. Saleh spending some time with Green Bay at the end of the regular season there. So I would agree with a lot of Packers fans that Casey Rogers probably would have been my number 1 choice to add in there. With Rogers and Washington, you have 2 coaches that also have defensive coordinator experience over there. So that would have been something. It's adding another position coach that's got defensive coordinator experience. Derek Ansley, the coaches of the defensive backs, pass game coordinator on the defensive side, was a former defensive coordinator for the Chargers too. So it would have been nice to have that experience, but that's not the tell-all, be-all sort of thing. So I think if, Casey's off, next for me would be Aaron from the Jets. I mean, you look at the group over there, I think, coming from a Robert Saleh tree, Halfley, kind of from a same system, I think those 2 would probably fit the system, or it's more similar fit at that point, considering the connections and such. So I feel like that's probably the leader in the clubhouse from players or from the coaches that we have heard about being interviewed with the Packers. But again, there could be ones out there that we haven't heard about yet that could get the job, or we'll hear about later, which that's how podcasts go. We record it and something else pops up. So quarterbacks coach wise, that's been pretty quiet. I think, last offseason when Sean Mannion was hired as a consultant, or an offensive assistant, it felt like, okay, is that the quarterbacks coach in waiting after Tom Clements calls it a career? And it very likely could be that could definitely be the case for this name out there, though. And he was a guy that, kind of like Robert Saleh, was spending some time with the team towards the end of the regular season. And it wasn't as popular as Robert Saleh and such, but he's also a former Packers assistant. And that's Luke Getsy. Had spent some time as a quarterback's coach in Green Bay, a wide receivers coach before that in Green Bay, offensive coordinator for the Bears and the Raiders, last couple of years. I would throw that name in the mix too. He's been in Green Bay, or was in Green Bay towards the end of the regular season with the coaching staff too. So I would maybe throw that name in the mix as well as maybe bringing him back as a quarterback's coach. So him or Sean Mannion, I would imagine, are probably the leaders right now for that job. So, but without further ado, let's kind of get to our self-scouting series here for the 715 Green and Gold Tailgate. I want to start off with the coaching, self-scouting some of the coaches. And when I talk about coaches, I'm talking about three of them specifically. Matt LaFleur, Jeff Hafley, Rich Bisaccia. We'll throw Adam Stenavich in there too, so that's four. I think, when you look at Matt LaFleur, there was some good moments this year. I know the easy thing is after a short playoff appearance and the way the regular season ended, there was a lot of calls from Packers fans to let him go, fire him, or he should at least be on the hot seat entering next year. And I get the frustration and I get the anxiety with, wanting to go deeper into postseasons and falling short. And after the season before, all the I think super high expectations this year. We had high expectations this year. And I'm not one that is going to be on the fire Matt LaFleur bandwagon. And that's not happening anymore at this point in time in the offseason. And I wasn't at that point anyways. But I also would agree with the thought that, okay, there's definitely areas that he needs to get better at and definitely areas that he needs to improve. But, when Malik Willis was in the first couple weeks or 2 and 3, I thought Matt LaFleur did a masterful job of game planning and calling the script and calling the plays there. And for whatever reason, especially the last couple of weeks, the offense, specifically the pass offense, was just a little off. It was off. I know Watson not being there didn't help with the deep pass threats. Kind of didn't feel like there was a lot of play action, even though Matt LaFleur would disagree with you and stuff like that. So And then I think one thing, too, we got to look at is time management, game management. He's got to get better at that, too. But I will agree that I think entering 2025 is a big year for Matt LaFleur. I think it's a big year for growth and taking a step forward. I mean, Packers general manager Brian Gutekunst essentially said the same thing. We got to, kind of increase the sense of urgency to compete for championships. And he puts the pressure on himself by saying that. He puts the pressure on Matt LaFleur for saying that. And he puts the pressure on the players for saying like that. And he's right. I mean, you look at the NFC North, that division is going to be brutal for the next few years. It's going to be very, very good. And the Packers can't rest on their laurels like they used to be able to in the past. They'll say they never did, and they probably did. But, you could kind of, when Aaron Rodgers, those 2000 teens, it was like, okay, Packers are going to win the division again. And you can't say that with the Packers, with the current state of this NFC North right now. So, I still think Matt LaFleur is a talented play caller, and I think he's a talented head coach. But there's no question there's different aspects of his game, if you will, that he has to improve. And, you're looking at game management. You're looking at time management. And I think, I don't know, by having Josh Jacobs, and this is not a knock on Josh Jacobs or the running game, did it get away from maybe, trying to utilize the passing game in a more creative way or trying to get Jordan Love in more of a rhythm at times, because I think that's got to be key. You got to get Jordan Love in a little bit more rhythm. And it didn't help, when you had your receivers dropping balls and guys getting hurt and such. But it definitely, and by all accounts too, we're making it sound like the offense sucked this year. And really, when you look at the last, rankings and such, they were a top 5 team in overall offense in terms of yards per game. So, but I think a lot of us would agree there is still something to improve on. And I guess to that situation too, you throw Adam Stenavich in that because he is offensive coordinator. Now he doesn't call plays, so he doesn't get the brunt of a lot of the anxiety from fans. Doesn't mean he doesn't do anything to help build that offense. But for the knocks that we're giving Matt LaFleur on the offensive side of things, I think Adam Stenavich probably wears some of that as well. Defensive coordinator, Jeff Hafley, for as long as, the last how many years, we always kept saying, as long as Aaron Rodgers, the Packers have a top 10, top 15 defense, that's all we want. Well, they got top 5, top 6 defense in a lot of categories. So vast improvement. Jeff Hafley should absolutely freaking be a nominee for the NFL Assistant Coach of the Year, and he's not. The turnaround that he had, yet it still felt like there was some things missing. And it was the pass rush. It was the front four. Let's be real. It was the front four not getting home at 4. You heard Matt LaFleur. I thought it was an interesting quote and a good quote or answer to a question when he was asked, what was your vision for this defense? And he mentioned, I would have liked to have gotten home with 4, not always having to bring extra blitzers and such and leaving more guys back in coverage. And I think that is definitely something the team's going to address this offseason. I really believe that. But all things considered, when you look at the numbers and you look at this defense, Green Bay didn't lose a lot of these games, especially down the stretch, because of their defense. I mean, their defense is what kept them in that game against Philadelphia, for crying out loud. So Jeff Hafley, I think deserves an A, B plus, A if we were to grade it. And I think, sky's the limit for this defense. I think now, year 2, guys are more comfortable. You would expect it to continue to get better and higher and higher. And maybe guys like Rashawn Gary and Kenny Clark and those guys just needed another year, Lucas Van Ness. But I would expect Brian Gutekunst to help out this defense a little bit more. And I would expect, this defense to continue to evolve and be better, which, when Jeff Hafley was interviewing for the Jets job, when was the last time we had Packers fans saying, no, please don't take our defensive coordinator? It's been a minute, right? It's absolutely been a freaking minute. So I'm excited for the future with Jeff Hafley. Rich Bisaccia is an interesting one. Now, at the time of this recording, there's a report out there that he could potentially be a candidate for the Dallas Cowboys head coaching job. Now, a lot of fans want to see Rich Bisaccia go too. They want to see him go to the wayside because the special teams miscues. He's not going anywhere unless he gets hired as a head coach. That might annoy some Packers fans. But for the stuff that we criticize the special teams for and blame Rich Bisaccia for, whether it's a fumble by Keyshawn Nixon or such, then you need to give him praise in other aspects, which includes the development of Daniel Whalen at punter. So, I mean, maybe a C around there if you wanted to grade the special teams aspect of it. So he isn't going anywhere. There's no question. When you look at stupid penalties and you look at miscues on that falls on the coach. The only thing I wonder now is there was a lot of young guys on there. Do they focus on maybe bringing in some more veterans, kind of like what they did when he first arrived to fix some of those issues? Is Keyshawn Nixon going to continue to be the returner, even though he says he doesn't want to be? So I'm fine with Bisaccia coming back. He's well respected by the players. He's well respected around the league. Yes, there was some miscues in the special teams. Part of me looks at it more from a personnel standpoint for there. So that's, we could go through different position coaches and such, but those are the big 4 when you think about, coaches on a staff. Continuing our self-scouting and moving to players now, defensive line. You look at this group, by far, I think, especially on the defensive side, if you talk about a group that has been the most disappointing, it would probably be the defensive line. I'm one of them, and I think a lot of people had high expectations for this group. Moving to a 4-3, like I was one too, like, okay, Kenny Clark's been playing in a 3-4 for all of his career. I think he's going to eat within the style of defense, moving into an interior defensive lineman on a 4-3 defense. And it was a pretty quiet year for Kenny Clark, especially when you factor in he got that new contract coming in before the season. There was high expectations for him, and we didn't see that. We didn't see that play, that top interior defensive lineman play that I think a lot of us were expecting and frankly hoping for. We didn't get that. So there's a spotlight, I think, on 97 coming into next year. Did it take a year to get adjusted to this style of defense? I don't know, but there's definitely a spotlight on 97. We got to have improved play from Kenny Clark going into next year. Devontae Wyatt was their best pass rusher from a defensive line standpoint. The problem with him was he was getting hurt at unfortunate times. So Carl Brooks made some plays here and there. I would not be surprised if the Packers go in free agency and find some defensive line help, defensive end help. I think mostly probably coming from the interior on the defensive side, but I would not be surprised if that's a big priority or the number one priority for the Packers is to get some defensive line help, especially coming from free agency. Somebody who can make an impact day one. It's one thing to get a draft pick, but Green Bay's a lot of times have drafted in the first round guys that, the ceiling may be incredibly high and the potential may be high, but they're raw, So it's going to take a little bit. Lucas Van Ness, Devontae Wyatt, et cetera, et cetera. They need an impact defensive player right away. If you're going to draft a first rounder this year, I want that player to be an impact player right away. So I look at them potentially going to free agency and getting that defensive line player. Or maybe it's an edge rusher. Maybe it's a defensive end. Rashawn Gary isn't going anywhere, but I think we all wanted to see a little bit more from Gary this year too. Did it take a little bit of an adjustment going from a 2-point stance, standing up to a 4-point stance? Who knows? I think we'll find out a little bit more next year, but no question about it. Rashawn Gary needs to be a more dominant pass rusher. He is not in the category of a Myles Garrett, a TJ Watt, a Max Crosby, or any of those guys. And he needs to be. And he's not there yet. And I don't know what we got with Lucas Van Ness yet. Sure, the advanced pressure numbers, out there have gotten better for Lucas Van Ness, but pressures are a good thing, but pressures have to lead to sacks, though, too. So I've gone back and forth on that. You hear coaches say sacks aren't the be-all, tell-all, and I think a sack doesn't tell the whole story. I would agree with that. I think pressures are a part of a story that needs to be told when you talk about a player. But at the same time, what's the end result of a pressure? If there's a pressure but the quarterback's escaping and you still pick up a first down, does it matter? Pressures have to lead into sacks, and pressures have to come from the front four. You look at what the Rams have done with their young interior linemen, rookies, Fisk and Jared Verse, what they did in the playoff, getting after the Eagles in their loss. That's what I want for my defensive line. So definitely got to add a piece or two to the defensive line going forward. But I do think heading next year, it's going to be a big year for Rashawn Gary and Kenny Clark. And I want to see more from Devontae Wyatt too. We saw those glimpses of him potentially being a really good player. He's just got to stay on the field and be available. Moving to the offensive side, we're going to go a little bit back and forth here. The next position group I want to talk about is the wide receivers, and I think this is another intriguing group heading into this offseason. Obviously, with the injury to Christian Watson, that has, I think, put this group into question a little bit more. He's going to miss a big chunk of next season. And before that, too, there was the question of okay, do they need a number one? At the beginning of the offseason or this season, they don't need a number one. They spread the ball around. Now it's back to, do they need a number one? Do they need a veteran to lead the group? And I think with Watson being hurt, that puts it into question a little bit more. And I don't, Romeo Doubs with a couple concussions towards the end of the season and then, suspended earlier in the year. I'm in the camp of I think they should bring in a veteran. Now, I don't think they should splurge for a guy like T. Higgins. Now, I'm not going to complain if T. Higgins is the guy. If they sign T. Higgins, I'm like, all right, let's go now. We got ourselves a playmaker at wide receiver. Do I think they need to go all out for that? Not necessarily. I don't. Could it be a Devontae if he's released? Maybe. I think I wouldn't mind a veteran for a couple years just to provide a little bit more leadership in that room. Because remember, last year Watson and Dobbs were the veteran leaders, and they were entering their second year. During the Ted Thompson era, Packers did a fantastic job of developing receivers. And when it was time to move on from your number one, you had a number one in waiting. And Green Bay didn't have that. When Devontae left, and it was Alan Lazard, and then you had some rookies with Watson and Dobbs. And then, you move on. Well, you had Cobb in there a little bit too, but he wasn't much of a playmaker there. But you kind of lost that passing the baton there. So I want a veteran in. I don't necessarily want to invest long-term because I still think Jaden Reed's going to be a playmaker. I still think Dontavian Wicks could be a really good player. I look at his second year, ups and downs. Devontae went through a similar thing there too. And I think they got to get to Tucker Kraft more. I don't want to bring in a high-priced wide receiver where it then would stunt the growth or take away from what Jaden Reed and Dontavian Wicks and Tucker Kraft can do. I don't want that. So if you can get in a veteran receiver who can be a go-to guy, and that's the thing, when I think about a number one, I don't want that person, I think we so focus on number ones being the guy that's going to get you 1,600 yards, double-digit touchdowns. I want a number one option. I want a number one guy where if it's 3rd and 1, 3rd and 2, 4th and 1, and you need to play, you need to make a catch, you're going to that guy. Or you can scheme that guy open so that they can make a play. That's how I view a number one. And I don't know if they got that guy yet. I think they got some candidates still, whether it's Reed, whether it's Tucker Kraft. So I think, yes, I would like a veteran receiver. T. Higgins would be awesome. I mean, we want all the best players out there. But if I had to pick, I would probably pick defensive lineman first and then a wide receiver if you could get a veteran for a couple years. I mean, Devontae would be perfect if it was like a couple years and, not a ton of cash. But I do think that's going to be something. I'd rather have them get a veteran wide receiver instead of getting another receiver in the draft, if you will. And then finally, the final position group that we're going to look at is cornerbacks. Again, I think this is an intriguing group heading into the offseason. The big question is going to be Jair. Is Jair back or not? And Jair, when they were cleaning out locker rooms, didn't want to talk to media, said he didn't have anything nice to say, and, wasn't sure if he was going to be there next year anyways. Goody said in his season end presser that there was frustrations, not with each other, but just the fact that, he could get on the field and that, but he said the contract wouldn't hinder Jair being back on the team or not. That's the number one question. If Jair's there, I still think they need a corner, but maybe you can address it a little bit later in the draft. If he's not there, then I think you need to address it early in the draft. I think you need to get a corner early, whether it's first or second round. I think they like Carrington Valentine. I think they like Keyshawn Nixon. I know Keyshawn Nixon wants to be a cornerback one. I don't know if he's got that skill set. I don't know if he's got that ability yet. So I think they'd be good with those two. And then you got Javon Bullard playing the slot nickel role there, which I think he still needs a little bit of development, but we'll get to that when we get to the safeties aspect. I'm still going to lump him in the safeties group for this. But Eric Stokes won't be back, so they need more cornerback help. And a lot's going to depend on if 23's back. I like Jair. When he's healthy, he's one of the best corners in the league. The problem with him the last couple of years has been availability. And if he's already got the attitude, and I don't know if he does or not, but if he's checked out, doesn't want to be there, then you got to move on from him. But if you have Jair coming back, you can wait and maybe get a corner day 2. If he's not there, you definitely for sure have to get one early in day 2, and you need more depth over there. So I think they would be okay with Carrington and Keyshawn being their top 2 corners, with Javon, slotted in that slot role, nickel role. But they definitely need more cornerback help. Jeff Hafley is a defensive backs coach by trade. I'm going to trust his judgment when it comes to corners and secondary players. They definitely need more depth over there. They need some more talent. And I want a shutdown corner, too. I want a corner where you don't have to worry about that guy a whole lot, because then that allows you to do more things on the defensive side, right? You have your corner, say, lock that side of the field down, lock that guy down. It allows you as a coordinator, as a defensive coordinator, to be a little bit more creative. So the big question with this group is going to be Jair. If Jair's there, you still need a corner, but maybe you can wait a little bit later in the draft. If he's not there, then I think it moves up sky high in terms of a draft need, and maybe you look at free agency to bring in some more depth over there too. That's going to do it for this episode of the 715 Green and Gold Tailgate Podcast, a part of the Man Cave Podcast. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to either the Man Cave Podcast or the Green and Gold, the 715 Green and Gold Tailgate Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. If you could, for both, 5-star rating, positive review so others can find the podcast. Till next time, I'm Dan Casper. Big thanks for tuning in. We'll talk to you in the next episode of either the Man Cave Podcast or, again, the 715 Green and Gold Tailgate Podcast.